So ladies, this week, week number 5, we're going to be discussing the gospel according to Matthew. So Matthew's gospel was written somewhere between 75 to 90 AD. Most theologians place it closer to 80 to 90 AD. And even though it was written second, you may have noticed that it's placed first in the New Testament. So there's lots of reasons why we think that it was placed first. One of the biggest reasons is because Matthew's gospel begins with a genealogy, and it connects Jesus to King David. And so this is important because A, it's a great bridge from the Old Testament into the New Testament, so it makes sense for it to be the first book. And B, because the author is writing to Jewish Christians, and they're trying to convince those people that Jesus is the Messiah using a lot of Mosaic law and a lot of references to the Old Testament. So starting with this genealogy shows that Jesus is a direct descendant of David, which the prophets all said would happen. And so that's one reason why it's first. Second of all, it does go into much more detail about the teachings of Jesus, which Mark's gospel did not do. Third of all, it was used, we think, the most often by the church leaders because it also deals a lot with the nature and function of the church. It's the first gospel, the only one, I think, to use the word ecclesia, which is the word, Greek word that's translated to mean church. So because of the way it portrays Jesus, the portrait in this gospel of Jesus is as a teaching savior, and it shows all of these teachings. And because the early church leaders probably used it the most, and because it's a great bridge from the Old Testament to the New Testament, Matthew's gospel is placed first. One thing you might have asked yourself is, who is Matthew? So we believe Matthew was a tax collector. He's referred to in the Bibles as the tax collector. He's sometimes also called Levi. Really not much is said about him, and most theologians don't think he was the actual source for this gospel. As I've already clarified, the physical person who writes it down is probably someone anonymous, but they don't even really believe that this anonymous person based what they were writing off what Matthew had said. And the biggest reason for this is because Matthew's gospel, obviously the author, whoever it was, had a copy of Mark's gospel because much of what's in Matthew's gospel was also in Mark's gospel. And so it really doesn't make sense if this person who was the source for all this information was an eyewitness to everything that Jesus did and everything Jesus said, then why would they need to rely so heavily on the Gospel of Mark? Because we know Mark was not an eyewitness. So it really doesn't make sense that Matthew could be the source of this information, but at the same time, someone attached the name Matthew to it, and for most of the centuries since it's been written, it's been known as the Gospel according to Matthew. So I want to talk a little bit about the sources quickly. What most theologians believe, again, is that Mark's gospel was written first, that Matthew and Luke then kind of sitting side by side with each other, not side by side, sorry, they were not sitting side by side. They were in two different places, kind of far away from each other, not knowing the other person was writing, and therefore they end up with a lot of the same stories. And you can trace most of those stories back to Mark's gospel. So that probably means that both of these authors had a copy of Mark's gospel. And then there is information that's in Matthew and Luke that you can't find from Mark. But again, they were not sitting side by side. They were way away from each other. And therefore, we think there's another source called the Q source that they probably both had a copy of that has disappeared. And I think that this was talked about in chapter 6 also. But anyway, so Matthew, his sources would have been Mark and this Q source. And then there's some information that's only in Matthew's gospel, and that would be called the special Matthean material or the special M material. So some of the themes that you can find in Matthew's gospel would be, first of all, that Jesus is the Messiah. They use at least 60 references to the Old Testament to kind of prove that all the things the prophets said were true when it came to Jesus. That he is the great teacher, and there's many parables in this gospel and many times where Jesus teaches about morality or what's right and wrong. He does warn them about hell in this gospel more than the other gospels. Mark's gospel did not do much of this. Another interesting thing that's different between Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel, or I should be saying the gospel according to Mark and the gospel according to Matthew, is that in the gospel according to Mark, the author believed that the parousia, or the second coming of Jesus, would be any day. But by the time this gospel is written, it has become clear to the leaders of the church that this might not be tomorrow, that it's going to be a long time, and that there's going to be some waiting involved, and that we have no idea the day or the hour, but that it will happen, just that we don't know when. And as I said earlier, this gospel is concerned with the nature and the function of the church. So what does it mean to be church? How can we be church? And, what needs does the church have or face at this specific time in history? One part of the gospel that I wanted to talk a minute about is called the Sermon on the Mount, and Luke's gospel has a similar incident. But this was pretty famous from the Gospel according to Matthew, where Jesus is sitting on a hill teaching to this crowd of people. And one thing that he teaches is called the Beatitudes. And I would say the Beatitudes are kind of the New Testament version of the Ten Commandments. But the Beatitudes are basically attitudes that we should be, kind of attitudes we need to adopt. And these, again, are talked about in the Sermon of the Mount. And also part of the Sermon of the Mount is a famous little section called the Antitheses. And in this part, it has sort of a basic pattern that says, you have been taught blank, and now I teach you blank. So you've been taught an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but now I teach you turn the other cheek. And I think this is also a reason why Matthew's gospel fits nicely at the beginning of the New Testament, because the word testament again means covenant. And so what we see Jesus doing is updating the law. He's updating the covenant, and that's an important element to Matthew's gospel as well. The textbook, of course, will go into more detail about this, but I wanted to give you some of the basics. And I want to remind you also that you're taking quiz 2 by the end of this week, as well as doing another discussion. Thank you.